Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, acclaimed novelist Jane Smiley discusses her biography of a significant contributor to the technological era, John Atanasoff. In her book, The Man Who Invented the Computer, Ms. Smiley introduces the physics professor so frustrated by performing tedious math calculations that he created a machine which would do it for him, later known as a computer. Ms. Smiley discusses the road traveled by the inventor and why he remained unknown for so long, with Washington Post technology reporter Cecilia Kang.
Hello, I'm Cecilia Kang. I'm a technology reporter for the Washington Post, and I'm joined here with Jane Smiley. Very pleased to see you and have you here. Jane has written a really interesting book that's sort of a departure, it feels, from a lot of her work. The Man Who Invented the Computer, the biography of John Atanasoff, actually John Vincent Atanasoff. Jane, this seems like a departure. It's a biography, a thriller as well. Different from Thousand Acres, different from a lot of your works that you're better known for.
Yes.
Why write this book? What interests you about John Atanasoff?
Well, I taught at Iowa State, and I spent a long time at in Iowa, the state of Iowa. And my second husband was the editor of the Palimpsest magazine, which is the history magazine of Iowa. And around the time that the first book was written about Atanasoff, he wrote a little article for the Palimpsest about Atanasoff. And I remember sitting across the table from him and him telling me the principles behind the ABC computer, the first computer. And they were so crystal clear to me. He explained them clearly, and it was so interesting to me how they gelled in my mind, that they stuck in my mind. Subsequently, I was asked to write a book about an American inventor, and I said to the person who was talking to me, well, do you know who invented the computer? This was about 4 years ago. And that person said, no. And I thought that was really amazing, that the computer. There are a lot of reasons for that. There have been books written before about this subject, and they're all about my guy was first, no, my guy was first, no, my guy was the real guy. And what I decided to do was read all the books about all the guys and then organize it chronologically, and to see not just who invented the computer, but how the invention of the computer came about. And it turned out to be a much more dramatic, almost breathlessly dramatic story than I had realized. Atanasoff's story is very much an all-American, poor boy makes good story. He was incredibly energetic. His childhood was extremely dramatic. His father's childhood was extremely dramatic. And so that's a kind of American, sort of classic American story. At Iowa State, we were always proud of the fact that he was a student and a teacher at land-grant universities. That meant that he had access to an engineering department. People with computer ideas at much more prestigious universities who didn't have access to engineering departments didn't get to have hands-on building of their projects. It was much more difficult. So if, for example, Atanasoff's first job acceptance after he got out of graduate school was to Iowa State, his second job acceptance was to Harvard. If he had, if things had switched, he might have gone to Harvard, never invented the computer, because he was walking across, when he had the computer ideas in his mind, he was walking across the campus. He ran into a guy he knew from the engineering school. He said, "Say, do you have a graduate student over there who could help me?" And the guy said, "Oh yeah, I know just the one, And it was an engineering student from north of Ames, Gladbrook, who'd spent his entire childhood fixing radios in his dad's radio shop, So that's the thing that eventually got me so deeply interested in this whole story, because there were so many things that happened that could have gone another way.
Right.
One of the most interesting ones was that one of the stories I talk about in here is the story of Colossus, which was the British code-breaking computer during the Second World War. And the engineer on Colossus was a man named Thomas Flowers. And in September, late August, early September 1939, he happened to be in Germany doing some research. And the British declared war, and he realized he had to get out of Germany, and he got out with 2 hours to spare. And at the end of the war, when they asked him, or later in the 70s, they asked him about inventing Colossus, he was really the only person who could have invented it. And he said, if I hadn't gotten out of Germany, it might not have been invented, and the war might have gone another way. And this is an amazing story, but the story of the invention of the computer is chock full of amazing stories. So that's what got me involved.
Absolutely. And in fact, it feels like that tension between that sort of American principle or ideal of working hard and pluck mixed with chance and luck is a big part of it. And one section that's part of your intro, where you say, the story of the invention of the computer is a story of how a general need is met by idiosyncratic minds, a story of how a thing that exists is a thing that could have easily existed in another way, or indeed not existed at all.
Well, somebody had to invent some kind of calculator, because by the time Atanasoff was a graduate student, his PhD thesis was 3 or 4 pages long, very short. But the calculations for it, which he did by hand on a Monroe calculator, took him months and months and months. And so much had been learned since, say, the middle of the 17th century, when science really began to take off in Europe. A lot of things had been learned, but the ability for mathematicians to calculate whether those things were true or not had fallen behind, because there was no way to do those calculations by hand.
Right.
So that it was really obvious to a lot of people, and Atanasoff was one of them, partly because he had done his dissertation, partly because he was a teacher. It was really obvious that there was a need there. But nobody knew exactly how technology was going to meet that need. A lot of people thought maybe the Charles Babbage machine that had been invented in the 19th century, the analytical engine, a lot of people thought that was going to be the way to go. But Atanasoff saw that as numbers got bigger and bigger, you couldn't enlarge your slide rule, which is the paradigm of the analog calculator. You couldn't enlarge your slide rule enough to make those numbers manageable. So one of his main, and I promise not to go into technical things, but one of his main insights was that if you used a binary number system rather than a decimal number system, and a binary number system is all numbers are made of 0 and 1, that then you didn't have to have a giant slide rule. You could have something like a light bulb or a vacuum tube that just went on and off. On was 1, off was 0. Yes. And so that was one of his primary insights. But he just happened, because his mother, Iva, had taught math, or taught arithmetic and math when she was a young woman. She happened to know about binary number systems. So she happened to, seeing that Atanasoff was interested in all sorts of things as a kid, she happened to teach him number systems. You can see her sitting in the rocking chair, knitting with the children at her feet, scratching her head and saying, "What can I do to make this kid
understand?"
To keep this kid occupied, because he was just voracious about every activity, and so you can see her. As a mom, I see her teaching him binary number, teaching him all kinds of number systems like base 12 and base 2 number systems, just to keep him quiet.
Mind games. That's really funny. And in fact, you were saying, and I hope you do go into more technical details, because the binary system is the basis of computing, and that is the big breakthrough. And I wonder if there was any point, Jane, when you were looking into this, and yes, that was a breakthrough for his, where you question, maybe maybe he really wasn't, or the real inventor of the computer, because that is a subject of debate, right?
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be. Okay.
It has been. There were a couple of things that happened. World War II came along. He had invented what is now known as the ABC, the Atanasoff Berry computer, named after him, his graduate student, Clifford Berry. They built it in the basement of the physics laboratory. The physics building at Iowa State. They just were given a corner in the basement. Eventually, walls were built around that corner and doors were put in, and the doors were too small for the computer to be removed. Oh. He tried to patent it, but the war came along, and once he left Iowa State, it just became not important to the university to patent the machine. Mm-hmm. But he thought it was being patented. He came to Washington. He went to work at the Naval Ordnance Lab. In the meantime, he had met a man at from the University of Pennsylvania named John Mauchly, who came out to Ames and looked at the computer and read all about it, and Clifford Berry showed him how it worked. He had hands-on experience of the computer. He went away, came back to Philadelphia, and met another man in Philadelphia, another student, or former guy who just had his BA, named Presper Eckert. And this was all the rage. What are we going to do? How are we going to calculate the things that the war effort needs? Yes. And so Mauchly wrote to Atanasoff in October and said, what if we tried building your computer here? Do you think that would be okay? And Atanasoff was sort of moderately unencouraging because he still wanted his invention to be patented. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, the man who was in charge of the project that Mauchly was working on, who was associated with the Army, was a man named Goldstein, who was also a mathematician. And he was walking along. This is another one of those coincidences. Yes. He was on a platform in Philadelphia, and he saw John von Neumann, who was quite famous at the time because he was working. He was famous as a mathematician, and he was also working on the atom bomb. Yes. And he walked up to von Neumann and sort of sucked up to him, and finally said, and I'm working on a computer project, and von Neumann just went, wow, yes. So von Neumann got very involved.
He knew the value.
Mm-hmm. And von Neumann, of course, had absolutely top security clearance. He was also extremely sociable. And he used to, from time to time, go over to the Naval Ordnance Lab and chat up at Atanasoff. And by the end of the war, Mauchly, Eckert, and a bunch of other people had built ENIAC. And Mauchly would go over to the Naval Ordnance Lab and talk to Atanasoff about computer ideas too. But when Atanasoff was invited to look at ENIAC, this table is round, but the ABC was about as big as this table. Oh. If this table were rectangular, and ENIAC was about as big as this room.
Wow.
And so Atanasoff looked at it and said, okay, he must be right. They did build computer completely on different principles than my computer. And he was an enterprising guy. He went into business. He made millions of dollars doing other things. And then starting in the early 50s, but sort of wandering on through into the 60s and 70s, the various companies that were involved in ENIAC and also in other computer ideas.
Mm-hmm. What were those companies, for example, at the time?
Well, there was IBM, there was Sperry Rand, there was, God, I don't even remember anymore, Consolidated Engineering,
interesting.
A bunch of them who had come into the computer business for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Honeywell was one of them, and they got their big boost from inventing the thermostat, Yeah. But they all wanted to be doing computers because they realized that there was a need for this.
Yes.
So, but finally, Atanasoff, they did approach Atanasoff and say, we think we think that these patents could be broken. What paperwork do you have? Well, Atanasoff was an incredibly organized guy, and he said, oh, I got paperwork going back to 1929, so he pulled out all the paperwork, and he was able to demonstrate where he started, where his ideas came from, why he had them, what they meant, what he did with them. And so when they did a court case in Minneapolis, concerning where the ideas originated, Atanasoff just had so much of a paper trail, and also such a perfect memory for everything that he had ever thought, that he won the case. Mauchly could not remember, and he was told by his lawyers not to remember everything.
Why is that?
Well, why do lawyers do anything?
Right.
I think what the lawyers were thinking was that it's very, very, very unusual for a court to abrogate a patent that's already been issued. And they figured that momentum was on their side. And so they didn't understand how much information Atanasoff had.
And that was
huge. There were other complications which the book goes into, which are all in themselves quite interesting.
It's really dramatic as well, yes.
But basically, Mauchly had to prove a negative. He had to prove that even though he went to Iowa and he did look at the computer and he did have no paperwork showing his ideas before that he had to prove that he wasn't influenced by Atanasoff. Yes. And it's very, very hard to prove a negative. So they abrogated the patent. However, as I, the writer, I'm going through the history of the Colossus, the history of the Enigma, the history of the German computer built by Konrad Zuse in Berlin, all through the 30s. What I am seeing is not that Mauchly did a wrong thing. Who knows? Maybe he did. I don't know. But that he was the guy who carried the little plant out of the greenhouse into the world. Because Colossus was destroyed. Tommy Flowers was forbidden ever to put it on his resume. Alan Turing was forbidden ever to put Colossus on their resume, on his resume, because of security reasons after the Second World War. So there went Colossus as the originator of the modern computer. The Zuse computer, and absolutely miraculously, they got it out of Berlin, and the story of how they got it out of Berlin really makes your hair stand on end. But then once they got it into a stable somewhere in Austria, what were they going to do with it? So it couldn't originate a computer either. So Mauchly was as essential to the building of the modern computer as Atanasoff was, because the ABC was destroyed, the Colossus was destroyed, the Z4 was sidelined. Where were they going to go? Well, they went to ENIAC. ENIAC had its origins in ABC, but Mauchly was the only guy. He was the only guy who cared, who was able to see what the ABC was all about, and could carry that idea from Ames, which, it's a wonderful town, but it's a little out of the way. Sure. From Ames to Philadelphia, where in the Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. nexus, there was a network that would allow
I thought that was fascinating.
Computer to be built. And there was money, I think Atanasoff's first grant for building the computer was $650. And
Amazing.
He spent $250 on equipment,
and the rest was labor.
$500 for Clifford Berry.
Wow.
But, I could talk about this all day because it is such an interesting story. It's not one that I made up either, so I don't feel like I do with the novel, where I'm saying, okay, here's my novel, here's the story, I made this up, it's pretty good. I'm saying, as a spectator, like anybody else, wow.
It's clear.
It's
clear the excitement you garner from the discoveries of the history, and and again, this is sort of a departure for you. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about some modern day examples and parallels, and you see these great wars over the patents for smartphones today, between Apple and Google and Motorola and Nokia, and there's tons of patent wars right now, and who has the claims. Aside from the commercial value, why are these battles interesting, do you think? Why?
Well, I don't know about the new ones, but this battle is interesting because in some sense Atanasoff is one of the last sort of solitary inventors. And he didn't want to be. He would have liked to have had university support, but he didn't get it. So here he is in the basement of the physics building. He's thinking the thoughts, and Barry and he are talking, and they're putting it together. So they're kind of the last of a certain kind of inventor that we think of.
And what kind of this is an inventor driven by just solving a problem?
Yeah.
Okay.
He really wanted to solve a problem, but he also had a certain type of personality, which was what some people call a problem-finding personality. When he was a kid, he had a fascinating childhood. And he was really well known for, he learned to drive the family car when he was 12. He learned to fix it when he was 12 and a half.
Amazing.
I
hope he was tall. With long
he
legs.
was tall. But his dad had a full-time job, but they lived on a property that was a farm and grew vegetables and stuff like that. And he ran the farm. His whole life was about seeing what was necessary, and then not only producing what was necessary, but fixing what was already there, making that work better. One of the things he did in the war, he worked for the Naval Ordnance Lab, so one of the things he had to do was study the acoustics of a certain atomic blast on Bikini Atoll.
Wow.
And he got out there and he said, well, I don't think I have the right equipment here, but let's see, what should we do? And he put it all together and
wow.
and did the acoustics properly. So that's just the kind of the guy he was. He was enterprising, he was driven, he was incredibly intellectually curious. He drove, when he had 3 kids, and the story was always that he drove the school crazy because they would call him in for a student-teacher conference, and then they'd spend 5 minutes talking about the kids, and then an hour of him telling the school what they should be teaching the children in the science curriculum. So he just had this incredibly capacious and voracious mind. But yet every character in the book is unique. So on the other end, let's say of the spectrum, of the practicality spectrum, we have Alan Turing, who is the most famous person who's in the book. Well, John von Neumann is very famous too. But von Neumann's wife said he couldn't manage a screwdriver, but he could fix a zipper. So it wasn't going to be von Neumann who went out in the garage and figured out how to put it all together. But it was going to be von Neumann who understood the implications of everything. And who was the connector, the one who met Turing, the one who met Mauchly, the one who met Atanasoff, the one who did the atomic bomb calculations. So von Neumann is a very enigmatic and interesting character too. And then there's Turing, who conceives of what a computer is. So Atanasoff conceives of a machine that works like a brain. Turing conceives of a brain that works like a machine.
Interesting.
And it just demonstrates the different ways that their minds were working. Well, for a novelist, this is like gold.
Yes.
How is this person's mind working in contrast to this person?
And getting to the same point in the end.
And Zuse, the German guy, who truly is one of the characters of the 20th century, one of the ultimate characters.
Please tell us a little bit about some of the highlights.
He's the only one who wrote an autobiography, and it is translated into English.
Correct.
And he came at it through design. He, even as a child, he remembers living in Berlin and looking at the way that the bridges cross one another downtown and being fascinated by that.
That is
He was an artist. He liked to draw. And his first invention was the invention that immediately predated the computer was basically a dispensing machine where you'd put in a Deutschmark and get an orange, you know. So he was interested in the mechanics of certain things.
Sure. Which is problem solving in itself. It's just, but with another element.
But with a different element. And so what he did, he invented 4 computers, the Z1, the Z2, the Z3, and the Z4. He was working on the Z4 in Berlin while it was being bombed by the Allies. And his workers were people that were not eligible for the armed services. Either they were blind, or they had gotten in trouble, or they were women, or whatever. And he'd say, I need a piece of, what do I need a piece of today? Oh, I need a piece of copper wire. So a couple of guys would run out and see which streetcar had been bombed, and they'd go snip off a piece of copper wire and bring it back. And his escape, I'm not even going to tell about his escape from Berlin because it's so eye-popping. But when he did escape, he ran into Werner von Braun at the place where they were all being kept in Austria. And he said, you know, Mr. von Braun, or Herr von Braun, Dr. von Braun, I've invented a computer. And von Braun basically said, it'll never get off the ground.
That is so. And look where we are today.
Isn't it funny?
I did find the backdrop of the war to be, because I couldn't help but try to connect the dots to the modern day and the story, but the backdrop of the war provided so much more drama, the scarcity of resources, the drive. If I could ask you to fast forward to today, what are sort of the motivators, do you think, of technology today? And you mentioned that we don't have the sole inventor, that sort of archetype
Well, that's
anymore.
right, because what Mauchly did when he carried Atanasoff's ideas to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, was he carried a solitary inventor's ideas to a group.
Yes.
And the group gathered together. I mean, they weren't, they had a boss, you know, they had a designer, they had a mind who was in charge. But the group got together and came up with various ideas for how to build ENIAC and then UNIVAC and EDVAC and all of those things. So that's kind of the way invention takes place today. It's a group thing.
Yes.
Where people stimulate one another's ideas, and the problem that von Neumann had when he was thinking about the computer as it was in his time was, he was thinking, okay, who owns this? And von Neumann decided after his experience with the atomic bomb, he decided nobody owns this. These are ideas that were come up with by a group. We cannot assign ownership of these ideas to any one person. And they were also done on government funding, so they belong to the popular, they belong in common to everyone. And he set out to make sure that these ideas did go into the common knowledge and could not be patented.
Sort of like the internet.
Yeah.
The internet was built that way.
I think John von Neumann comes out as the most mysterious character here, partly because he died young. He did not leave any memoir.
Yes.
But he also had a very dramatic life. Anyway.
And how did you find out information about him then? How did you research him?
Well, there's a biography of him. And he was also famous, so there was a fair amount of material about him. I understand that a new biography is being written about him, and I hope some of the mysteries will be solved. He was a very sociable, smart guy, and everybody who knew him just wanted to be with him, wanted to keep talking to him. At the same time, he also believed that Stalin was going to bomb the U.S., and he was an architect of mutually assured destruction, and he said, which I quote in here, he said, "I want those Russian generals and Stalin to know that if they send a bomb this way, they're going to be blown up within the next half hour." So he's a really interesting person. Being in Washington reminds me that when Atanasoff lived here after the war, and he built his facility for his new company, he studied where the nuclear plume would go if Washington was bombed, and he built his company outside the nuclear plume. So this seems to us to be incredibly dated and weird and naive, and yet it's really a telling feature of the time that they didn't just, they expected it to happen, and they planned. They planned what to do in case it happened. So at the same time there's World War II going on, then a few pages later, there's the Cold War going on.
Yes.
And so the place where I'm typing on my Apple, seems so much beyond that. But this is how it came to be.
What characters that you looked into do you find yourself wanting to understand more? Which one?
Oh, von Neumann, for sure. Yeah.
And who did you lean on? Did you lean on any families for interviews or resources? Okay, what did you?
There are plenty of books that were written, there, and all the books are about, no, my guy invented the first computer, no, my guy invented the first computer. So I didn't want to necessarily add only to that.
Yes.
I wanted to explore the whole network, the whole system that resulted not in the first invention of the computer, but in the computer the original computer that came to be my laptop. And the principles of the Colossus were different from the principles of the ABC, and also different from the principles of the Zuse computer. So my laptop didn't have to end up the way it did. Maybe. We don't know.
Yes.
They did try putting a fairly modest mathematical calculation through the Colossus after the war, and it took a really long time. The Colossus was basically a word processor. And so would they all have merged in the end and come out with something like we have now? I don't know. But what I was interested in was how the system worked. But every single guy was mysterious in some way or another. Right. But I guess, maybe the most mysterious in some ways, or the most, not mysterious, but the most unknown, let's put it that way, is Tommy Flowers, the guy who put together Colossus. He never wrote anything about himself. He never said anything about himself. He was forbidden to talk about Colossus, and he just didn't do it. He did not talk about his collaboration with Alan Turing. He said a couple of things like, well, if I had a problem, Turing always could figure out something, But he didn't say what Turing's input was. He didn't say what his own input was, except that he did imply that he had built the Colossus. But all of this stuff about Colossus is really, there was a book out in 2006 about Colossus, but by 2006 a lot of the memories had been lost. And Churchill, I think there were 12 Colossuses or Colossi. 10 of them were destroyed. So when the book Colossus came out, it was pretty interesting to discover that the war could have gone another way. And that, and I talk about that in this book too, that part of the reason, one of the dramatic things that happened is that the first message, the first decoding of German army information that Colossus performed was performed the day before D-Day.
Oh, wow.
And they brought the note to Eisenhower, who was sitting in a room talking to his generals and making a plan. And he read the note and he said, "We go tomorrow." I mean, that's still
amazing. That is,
that still affects me, and I wasn't even alive.
Yes, it is amazing.
But it is amazing, and it's just with this. Every time you turn around, something amazing is happening. Even Atanasoff's own father his father was from a small village in Bulgaria that
Yes.
was then part of the Ottoman Empire. And that area rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. And as the family was fleeing the village, Atanasoff's father was carrying the baby who was, a few months old in his arms. He got shot through the back by a Turkish soldier. The bullet creased the scalp of the baby.
Yes.
As it exited the father's chest. The baby lived.
It's amazing.
So, I mean, that was,
Talk about chance.
I
Talk
haven't
about
even
fortune. Talk about the drama.
I haven't touched upon all the dramas. It's just one drama after another in this book.
How do you think that background, his family story, impacted him? Made him who he
Well,
was?
the father was a go-getter. The father came to America at age 12 or something like that,
Yeah.
and was one of those classic immigrant children in New York trying to make his way.
He was homeless for a while.
He was
Is that
homeless.
right?
He kept a chicken in his room for a while. But he managed to connect with a religious congregation and tell his story, earn some money, go to college, and then get married. And the father was constantly getting ahead. But all of the computer pioneers in here have these early 20th century stories
Yes.
of life on the street, working in the electrical factory, whatever. And so in that way, the whole story of the invention of the computer is a series of windows on
Times.
the world that used to exist and doesn't exist anymore.
That's so interesting. I wonder if, while you're writing this, did you think at all about what this portends about the United States as we go forward, given the recession?
No.
You didn't. Okay, because it's a discrete, different period. You didn't.
Yes, I mean, it's so different the way that they came to be. I mean, all of the inventors of the computer were born between about 1900 and about 1912.
Yes.
And so they were all born into Victorian families. They were all on the cusp of the New Age, and they didn't know what the New Age was, but they all had the sense, because they were scientists and mathematicians, they all had the sense of the pressure of data, the pressure of things that need to be organized, knowledge that needed to be organized. They all had this sense pushing them all the time.
Yes.
And I don't know that we have that sense anymore. Maybe there are other countries where this feeling of being on the cusp of something is current. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I don't think we live in that world anymore.
And that was certainly the time.
Yeah.
Jane, can you talk a little bit about, you started talking about how you came across the story and you learned about it. It all just sort of gelled to you that there are interesting characters. At what point did you realize, aside from these being interesting characters, this was worth a book? Is there a point when you do that?
When the person said, "I don't know who invented the computer," I knew,
Okay.
I knew it was worth a book. But then I went on the MIT inventor website.
Okay,
And
interesting.
there's no Atanasoff there. And there are, dozens and dozens and dozens of inventors on the MIT website. And some of the things they've invented you've never heard of.
Yes.
And so I decided, well, it was time
It made
to
sense.
try again, to try again to get him into the into modern consciousness. But the reason I didn't go to the families and say, now I did have access to a book that his granddaughter wrote and was published by a Bulgarian press because the family was Bulgarian. So I had access to more personal information, but I wanted the story to tell itself. Many books are about, many books are partisan.
Yes.
But the story is much more interesting if you're not particularly partisan. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to have an opinion about who you think invented it, but the story itself is way beyond the system of the story is way beyond, I'm giving your guy the elbow. And
Right.
and for me, that was, I grew up, or not, I didn't grow up, but for years and years, I thought of Mockley as the antagonist here. But when I read about it, I realized that Mockley was the savior, not the antagonist.
What a discovery.
Because he was the sine qua non, the without which not. If he hadn't gone to Iowa, it doesn't matter what his motives were. It doesn't matter how he subsequently acted. If he hadn't gone to Ames, then boom, the ABC would have been taken apart. It was taken apart, but it would have just been a pile of junk. So Mockley is, we could say Atanasoff is the inventor, but Mockley is the savior. And so I'm sorry that that there has been this partisan sort of antagonism between all the potential inventors, but that doesn't need to be.
It doesn't need to be. And I thought about, if you can sort of step back, and when you thought, as you researched and you learned more about the story, the way you wrote it, it does sort of feel like a biography / thriller, sort of the way that we were talking before. And maybe that's what's unique. And I mean, from a journalist's point of view, it's sort of, I could see, I would go about organizing this with he said, she said, he said, she said, but you didn't do that. You wove narratives that were interesting. So how did you think about the process of going about writing this and sort of the structure as you...
Well, as it gelled, it gelled chronologically.
Okay.
I realized that all I had to do really was, I had to do a couple of things. One was to tell the story chronologically because it was dramatic enough to unfold as a story. But the other one was that I had to be, and this was the hard one for me, I had to be pretty clear about the technical aspects of it. And I did show earlier drafts of the manuscript to a friend of mine, various friends of mine, and I would note, where people got bogged down. I mean, I have a friend who's a scientist, he's a veterinarian, but he's up to date in that way of thinking about the world, a technical, scientific way of thinking of the world. Yeah. And so if he's getting bogged down, we have a problem,
In terms of your reader.
Yeah.
Well, so, and that's a real obvious question. Are you, Jane, are you a techie?
No.
Let's talk about that. Yeah.
I mean, I understand the four basic principles of Atanasoff's ideas, but I got a guy named John Gustafson, who's a computer scientist, and who actually used to work at Iowa State, and he got a bunch of guys together in the 90s, and they rebuilt the ABC, and it's now in the Computer Museum in San Jose.
Oh, okay.
And he knew a lot about, he knew everything as far as I'm concerned, about not only the ABC, but how the ABC fits in with other computers. And he also, it was interesting to talk to him about putting it together, because he said only old guys could put it together, because they had to have the building skills and the technical skills that people would have had in the 40s. And even that has gone by the wayside.
What would you need? What do you mean by that? The building skills of the 40s? Just because we don't do that anymore?
Handling those kind of materials.
Oh, okay.
And, making, riveting things together and, just putting angle iron together. And
it's like shop class. We don't really do anymore, right?
And also understanding how vacuum tubes work and how capacitors work, because those are all outmoded things. And so he said he always made him laugh that his whole building group had white hair, except him, his hair was red. But I owe him a lot, and he was really great, and he explained a lot of things to me and sorted a lot of things out for me.
Well, it seems courageous. I mean, I cover technology, and I don't know if I would be able to set out doing this in that I would think it intimidating.
Out of ignorance, right? So I felt that since I understood those four principles, that somehow I would get through it.
Yeah.
And I did get bogged down from time to time in the tech stuff, but then the drama would just keep going. Right. The deaths, interesting deaths among the group. Clifford Berry, did he commit suicide? Alan Turing, did he commit suicide?
Yes.
You know, there's so many. Turing, as we all know, or as anybody who's interested in computers knows, Turing was an openly gay man, and in the 1950s he became unemployable, partly because of his openly gay status during the Cold War.
Yes.
So the question still arises: well, what happened to him? Did he commit suicide? His mother never believed that.
His mother never believed he committed suicide.
Right.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't go too deeply into all of that, but it's just another aspect of the drama.
Yes.
You know. And as I am sitting typing on my Apple computer, here's the bitten apple, which is a reference to the way that Turing committed suicide.
That's right.
So it's sort of iconic.
Can you explain to our audience a little bit more about
Well, Turing was killed by an apple that was infused with poison. Maybe he put the poison in there. Maybe somebody else put the poison in there. I don't know. But supposedly when Apple was founded and they got their icon. That was a reference
to that.
to the death of Alan Turing.
Are there any figures, moguls today in the tech world, that you find are you draw parallels to some of the characters in this book? I think about design focus and Steve Jobs, for example. Or do you not think that way?
I don't think that way.
Do you find
I don't
just
think that
fine?
way. They're maybe
In the way
maybe
they work.
Sergey Brin and the
Larry.
Google thing and
Yes.
Larry. What's his last name?
Sergey Brin and Larry. Now I'm blanking.
Sorry, Larry.
And,
But the way it seems to work now is that, or the way it worked with Google, the way it worked with Facebook, is that these young guys gather together somewhere, like at college, and they start talking, and they think, oh, let's go for it. We can do it. That's not exactly how Atanasoff worked. But maybe it would have been if he'd gone to Harvard and been Howard Aiken,
Yes.
But the other thing is what current tech people are coming up with are manages information. What Atanasoff and those guys were coming up with was the hardware.
Basic
So they had to have access to some way to put the hardware together, some way to try out how to make something, to make a real thing. When Alan Turing, at the same time that Atanasoff was sitting in the bar pondering his computer, Alan Turing was thinking that the technology was going to be more like the Liverpool tide predicting machine, which was pulleys and gears rather than light bulbs going on and off. But Turing didn't have access to the same kind of education that Atanasoff had.
Yes.
When Atanasoff went to the University of Florida and then Iowa State and then University of Wisconsin, he had access to a land-grant type education, which is a very practical education, so that Atanasoff could not become a mathematician at the University of, or a physicist at the University of Florida. It wasn't offered. He could go into the engineering school and take some courses. And that was the way the land-grant system worked.
That's interesting.
You weren't allowed just to think. You had to actually make something. But that's the way it worked with Zuse, too, because Zuse went to the Technical University of Berlin, and one of their courses, they had to go out in the street and work with workers who were building things. And so that pushed the way they thought into practical paths. Whereas when Turing was at Cambridge, nobody ever said a boo about, well, let's see how you would make that thing. Mm-hmm. So even though he might have been leaning toward making things, I mean, his relatives on his mother's side were engineers who were makers of things. He was never encouraged to do that. In fact, when he would make something at the school that he went to as a young boy, Sherborne School in England, it'd all get thrown away.
Huh.
He'd leave it on the windowsill and they'd get tossed because nobody wanted that junk around the room, you know.
It's amazing.
So that was another thing that fascinated me, was the way that the land grant system focused on one thing and the way that other types of universities like Cambridge and Princeton focused on another
Absolutely.
thing.
There were certain, again, another window of the history and the time, and how there were values assigned. Mm-hmm. Value was assigned in some instances and not others. And Jane, were you just particularly interested in that time of the century?
No.
Or no? It all just kind of gelled together.
It just came from being interested in Atanasoff.
Right. And did you find yourself researching more about the history of that time as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because I had to know, in order to learn about Colossus and Enigma, I had to know the progress of the war. So the Enigma machine, the Enigma code-breaking machine, was about naval codes, because and that was the first one that they resolved or solved. The Polish and then the English, building on the Polish solution of the Enigma codes. Because if there were a naval blockade of the British Isles, they wouldn't have been able to survive. So they focused on the naval one first. The codes that were made by the Lorentz machine, which was the Army code-making machine, were much more complicated. And those were the Army codes and also the codes with which Hitler communicated with his staff. Mm-hmm. They were much more difficult, but they weren't, at the beginning of the war, they weren't essential to the survival of England as an entity, because they weren't used by the Navy. But they were essential to the conquering, or to the resistance and ultimate resolution of the war, because once they knew that, the code that Eisenhower was interested in was the code about D-Day, of where were the German forces. And one of the things that he learned early on was that they had decided that D-Day was a feint and that they were really going to land to the south. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't move the German troops away toward the beaches at Normandy, which gave Eisenhower an incrwell opportunity.
Amazing. Mm-hmm.
So, and that's from Colossus.
That's amazing. And did you find yourself traveling to England or Germany in your research? No. Well, everything's available online now, Jane. So it's easy to find your research.
Actually, I did most of my research in actual
libraries, in books.
But I did order them online.
There's your connection on your Apple laptop. Will we see more biographies from you, Jane? Did you enjoy this experience?
I've written a biography before. I wrote a Dickens biography.
Oh, okay.
I did enjoy this experience. Am I going to do a biography of Samuel Birdseye, the inventor of frozen foods? I doubt.
That could be really interesting. And would you... and actually somebody approached you to write this, right? It wasn't your idea to come up to focus on an inventor, per se, right?
But it was sort of like the Dickens book. When I wrote the Dickens book, somebody approached me and said, we're doing a series about people who are still important in our world today. And I said, well, is Dickens on there? And they said no. And I said, well, so lots of times when I join a series, it's to fill in what I perceive as a gap.
Oh, great.
But, I'm still working on my own novels. I published a novel this year called Private Life, which is about a woman married to a crackpot scientist. So I was in that scientific mode.
Were you inspired with this novel? Were you writing at the same time? Or?
Yeah, I was writing at the same time. No, the crackpot scientist in my novel, who once worked at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., he wouldn't have fit in.
Okay.
With any of these guys. He was a true crackpot.
How do you do this, Jane? How do you write two books at the same time?
Well, that's something you try not to do, actually. But what you just get too far ahead of yourself, and you think, oh, I'll have finished that one by the time I start that one, and then it turned out that you didn't finish that one, but you still have to start the other one.
Right.
And I also am writing a book of a series of horse books for girls, but those are really very pleasurable. So,
are you into horses, or
oh yeah,
are your children? Oh,
I love
okay.
horses, and I love theories of training, and
Oh, right.
I love girls with horses, and so.
Can you, in our last minutes, can you talk a little bit about what inspires you? Who do you read? What do you read? What do you observe that draws inspiration for you?
Well, I get inspiration from almost everything. I tend to see something and say, oh, I like that, and then to find out all about it. I read the newspapers and I think, oh, wow, that's interesting, and I get involved with that. Mm-hmm. I'm usually about 3 projects behind things that I'm really interested in. I usually have a bunch of projects going on at the same time, and I think, oh, I'll have to do that, in 2 or 3 years
Sure.
when I'm finished with this or whatever. But I've never been at a loss for inspiration. Once I broke my leg and I didn't have anything to do, and I was uninspired for about a week.
Just 1 week. Pretty ambitious train there. Who is the audience for this biography? Who are you trying to reach out to? And what are the...
Everybody who uses a computer,
Right.
But since there's so much history in it, I think people want... there's a lot in it about the 20th century and how it unfolded. Atanasoff was born in 1903. He died in 1995. His life pretty much spanned the 20th century and was paradigmatic about how the 20th century worked in some ways.
That's right.
But I guess my general audience is men.
And me. And other women as well.
I hope so.
Well, no, I think it was written in a way that's very general and very helpful. And finally, what has been the response from Atanasoff's family, others in the story? What do they think of your take?
Well, his family likes it. I got an email from his son, adding a few little details, and I said, we can put those in the paperback, and he said, nah, who cares? No, they like it. And I have not gotten much of a response from the others, the others involved. But, these people were born 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So anybody who's still carrying the torch is, for whatever side, is pretty far removed from the actual incidents. I tried to be as objective and as possible and as accurate as I could be, and to say it's not about who was first. Those issues have been settled. It's really about how it happened.
Mm-hmm. How it happened. The Man Who Invented the Computer, the biography of John Vincent Atanasoff, digital pioneer, by Jane Smiley. Jane, thanks so much for coming by.
Oh, thanks for having me.